This is a lecture from Open Tuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.
F4 Global, Chapter 3. International Organisations. There's little point in me sitting here reading through these notes, so what I intend to do is, assuming that you have downloaded the notes yourselves and you've read through them properly, then I'll talk around them and add bits that are of interest and could very well come up in an exam question. So, for instance, on the first page of Chapter 3, International Organisations, I introduce you to the United Nations and its general purposes of maintenance of peace and security, development of friendly relations among nations, and so on. One or two other elements that I can add into that, and that the United Nations themselves claim that they do, is that they protect the environment, or they promote the protection of the environment. And another thing they do is they provide humanitarian aid. In those circumstances where humanitarian aid is required. So, for instance, in the context of famine or natural disasters, or even in armed conflict, where war breaks out or genocide is taking place by one group of individuals against another group of individuals, then humanitarian aid is available, or hopefully available, from the United Nations. The United Nations started off in 1943, in fact, with a discussion between Winston Churchill and Roosevelt in the United States, but it was formally created in 1945, and the first 7 nations, I think it was, joined together in 1945, and since then we're now 193 member states of the United Nations, 196 countries, and there are some observing states as well. So there are also areas where there is ongoing difficulty, like whether to recognize Palestine as distinct from Israel, whether to recognize Kosovo, Taiwan instead of, or as well as China. So we have these additional interests where independence is claimed but has not yet been recognized by the United Nations. It's meant to promote maintenance of peace and security according to their own statement. But at this very moment, whilst I'm talking, there are still 4 major wars or areas of conflict ongoing. And when I say major, that's conflict which has involved so far not less than 100,000 deaths. Mexico and the drug wars. There's Afghanistan, which is ongoing, and Syria, which is ongoing, and Iraq. Those are the 4 main theatres of war that are still ongoing. But in addition to that, there are more than 50 others involved. Skirmishes, arguments between tribes, discussions between tribal land rights, and even religion. There's, of course, the major one at the moment where Islamic State is waging war apparently against Western Europe in order to try to impose upon Western Europe their own fundamentalist religious beliefs. So although the United Nations does exist to maintain peace and security, there is a limit to what they can do, and in fact it's recognized that insofar as they are not as effective as they hoped they would be for maintaining peace and security, their role is now shifting more towards humanitarian assistance rather than to peace and security. Some say, and I give you this quotation just for interest, if I can find the page sufficient for me to write on it. Some say that the United Nations, and I'm quoting this, is an important force for peace, and human development. Well, that's very good, isn't it? That's the view of some people. But there is an alternative view, which I have to give you for a balanced perspective. And others say that the United Nations is ineffective, corrupt, and biased. And I'm prepared to leave it up to you to make your own mind up as to which way you think. Let's move on. United Nations Commission on International Trade. Again, I can read it out to you, but there's no point in me doing that. So I'd rather add little bits as I can, and then we can maybe consolidate and get a better picture, an overall picture. So one of two bodies concentrates on the development and codification. Modernization, I'm going to add in here, modernization and harmonization. Modernization and harmonization, rules of international business. This is another area of UNCITRAL, or United Nations Commission on International Trade Law. What they're trying to do, just generalize it, if you will. If you accept that as communications, the world of communications, the speed of travel, the infrastructure throughout the world, if you accept that this will lead to trade, then clearly there are going to be disputes arise, because the rules of trade and what is taken to be acceptable in one area of the world, or even one individual country, or even an individual part of an individual country, will not necessarily have the same equivalent rules in another part of that same country. And so when it comes to international trade, of course, there can be wildly different views and wildly different rules which are generally acceptable in those areas. So UNCITRAL has taken it upon itself to set about to harmonize the rules relating to international trade. And if you accept, as a general premise, if you accept that trade leads to faster growth, and that therefore the faster growth in trade leads to higher living standards, and therefore the increase in trade leads to new opportunities. But these new opportunities need to be controlled, need to be governed, in order that those new opportunities are seen to be fair to all those people involved. Coming down the page, towards the bottom of page 10, introduced by International Trade, introducing the Hamburg Rules. I've done it again. Also attempts to increase international trade by introducing the Hamburg Rules. They call the Hamburg Rules as an easy abbreviation for the United Nations Convention on the Carriage of Goods by Sea. So it also attempts to increase international trade by bringing in these rules covering the carriage of goods by sea, but also the use of international bills of exchange, which we will come to in a later lecture. Encourages countries to adopt UNCITRAL rules. Of course it does. And why would you have an establishment that creates rules and seeks to harmonise if you weren't also going to encourage other countries to participate and to adopt those rules. I've got here on page 11, the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, specific ways in which the UNCITRAL tries to harmonise and unify international trade. I was looking at the UNCITRAL website just before I started this lecture, and there are one or two things that they say about themselves, which, although they may be synonymized by this list that you have in front of you, nevertheless, we've got other things that they themselves talk about. So in order to increase these opportunities up here that I've just mentioned, by seeking to increase the opportunities, then we have to support them. I have to have an infrastructure in order to help to give the opportunity to people indulging in international trade to take full and fair advantage of those opportunities. So in order to increase these opportunities, UNCITRAL is formulating modern, fair and harmonised rules. I'll write that in: modern, fair and harmonised rules on commercial transactions. And of course, if we can establish a set of rules which is broadly acceptable throughout the world, that of course will make international trade so much more easy, so much more straightforward, so less exposed to disputes arising from misinterpretation, non-acceptance of generalized, harmonized laws. The way that UNCITRAL is doing this, and this is their own website that I'm quoting again, what they do is that they are arranging conventions or issuing conventions, model laws and rules that are acceptable worldwide. If they can do that, clearly trade will be much more streamlined and less subject to dispute. They're also issuing legal and legislative guides and recommendations which are, according to their own website, of great practical value. Well, they're not going to say they're not, are they? If they're going to take this time to issue these rules and regulations and legislative guides, they're not going to turn around and say, but these are of little use indeed to anyone. So it's a little bit of an obvious statement to say that they're of great practical value, but that's I'm quoting from their website that says this. Number 3, they issue updated information on case law and enactments. That's the changing of rules in various parts of the world. So different governments will enact different rules, and UNCITRAL will come up with these updated rules which are being enacted throughout the world, of uniform commercial enactments of uniform commercial law. Another thing they do is that they issue or give technical assistance in law reform, projects, like a helpline really, if you like. You know, when you're stuck on the internet, you press help. That's what Incoterms will do. They'll give this technical assistance in order to assist various governments and various organizations worldwide to draft enactments, to draft laws, to draft their own regulations, in order that they should be consistent with Incoterms' own, and that again will help trade. And finally, according to their website, they organize regional and national seminars of uniform commercial law. So that's what Incoterms say they do. That's their objective. That's what they're hoping to achieve. And that adds on. It's a little bit duplicated there, isn't it? Promoting ways of ensuring consistency, collecting and disseminating on legal developments and national legislation. Yeah, okay. But what I've just written on the screen is quotations from their own website, whereas what's typed in the course notes was my original summary of having done the research on the area. Don't have a lot to add in terms of the World Trade Organization. Again, it's formed in 1995, but do you see a question in F4 Global Law? Multiple choice. In what year was the World Trade Organization created? 1953, 1954, 1955, 1956, and you have to select the right one. I don't think so. I don't think you need to know that it replaced the was based on the principles of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trades. I don't think you need that at all. So I think a quick read of this would do. The one thing I missed off here, and it reminded me, the UN Conference on Trade and Development. They have a mission statement there. The mission statement is prosperity for all. I thought I should have put that in, of course, as I finished that page. But anyway, General Agreement on Tariff and Trades, World Trade Organization. And again, according to the World Trade Organization themselves, their fundamental objective is to improve the welfare of the peoples of the member countries. Improve the welfare of the peoples of the member countries. And that's what the World Trade Organization is seeking to do. Moving swiftly on, because we're getting to a particularly important bit, into the International Chamber of Commerce. International, again, there's no point in me sitting here reading this to you. Purpose is to serve the world business by promoting trade, investment and open markets. That's not going to benefit you, and it's going to be totally boring both for you and for me. So I want to move on a little bit further than, a little bit quicker than that, because I want to concentrate a little bit on these Incoterms. We'll find those on the next page in general, and then on the following pages in detail. So on the next page in general, Incoterms produced and promoted by the International Chamber of Commerce to address the main issues involved, and in particular, well, we have a problem here. If you think about it, if we're involved in indulging in international trade, and I'm selling goods from my manufacturing plant, and I'm selling them to you in an overseas country. I say overseas, not necessarily into a foreign country. It doesn't have to be by sea, obviously. So I'm selling my goods to you in a foreign country, and we need to know at what point do I cease to be responsible for the safety of those goods, and therefore the point at which you start to be responsible. And of course, there are different stages involved. Because if I say, yes, you can buy the goods, no problem at all, they're here at my factory, at my warehouse, at my manufacturing plant. If you come along and collect them, then the sale is made. Or, at the other extreme, I say, yes, of course I'll sell you some goods. Where do you want me to deliver them? And do you want me to deliver, do you want all the formalities sorted out, the export documentation from my part, the import documentation in your country? Do you want me to sort that out as well? Do you want me to pay all these duties, all these levies, all these taxes? And in which case, that's fine, no problem, I can do that. All the insurance and the freight and the carriage, yes, I can do all that, but it'll cost you. I shall charge you for it. Whereas if you came and collected from my manufacturing plant, then clearly I'll just charge you the selling price. So I think I'm selling to you out of my plant, my manufacturing plant. You think I'm selling these goods delivered to your doorstep, unloaded from the carrier, after having been shipped by sea maybe, or just driven across the continent, driven from northern France right the way down to South Africa. Is that what you want? Is that what you expect? Because if so, I'm going to charge you. So we need a set of rules, and that's what these Incoterms are. Incorporated into a contract to establish the extent of the service and the risk. And down at the bottom here, the extent of the service and the risk accepted by each of the contracting parties. And this will be reflected in the negotiated price of the contract. The next page tells you that Incoterms, and these must be learned. I would be staggered. I would be amazed if there were not at least one question in any F4 global law exam that did not involve identifying the impact or the meaning or the importance of an Incoterm, or more than one. I could see 2 or 3 questions being asked about Incoterms. Maybe not all for 2 marks, but nevertheless, I could see, certainly, I would be amazed if there were an F4 global exam that did not examine Incoterms. If there's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 marks in that exam involving Incoterms, they're relatively easily learned. Relatively. So here we are, we've got just 2 categories. This changed in 2010. I'm not going to tell you what the others were because clearly they're no longer applicable. And the 2 rules are any mode of transport or by sea or inland waterway. Any mode of transport rules, this is whether sea transport is involved or not. It doesn't matter whether sea is or is not involved, or even if it is involved, it's only for an insignificant, or only a part of the journey. So we're talking about overland travel, any mode of transport. You could give it to a courier, to DFS, you could DPD, you could give it to FedEx. This would be a carrier, or none of those big ones, TNT, none of those big ones. It could just be to an ordinary carrier, a local person who's carrying the goods from my manufacturing point to the place where you want them to be delivered. So any mode of transport is involved, whether or not it involves sea transport. There are specifically 4 rules that apply where sea transport is involved, but we'll come to those in a moment. These 7 rules apply, and these 7 rules apply to any mode of transport. Whether or not sea is involved. So these are applicable in any international trade of goods. So any mode of transport is where these 7 rules apply. Now, there is in Wikipedia, and I shall give you the reference at the end of the lecture, there is in Wikipedia a table that you can sit and peruse and look at and learn, and it's a very useful table. and it combines all of these. I have to say that in that table, these two are switched round. So CPT comes before CIP. But otherwise, they're in the right sequence. So my notes will probably be better if I switch those two around. You can read these, you can see what they are. X works, minimum obligations for the seller concerning the delivery. The buyer is responsible for all costs incurred, and so on. So it goes down: free, carrier, named place. The seller completes their obligations when the goods have been cleared for export and custody has been transferred to a named carrier at a specified place. Carriage paid to, the next one. The seller pays the cost of delivery to a stated location, and once at that location, the buyer then assumes responsibility. You can see thereafter, the next one, the buyer thereafter is responsible. The buyer is responsible. The buyer is responsible after the goods have been cleared for export and the goods have been given to a carrier. So this is the importance of these rules. There are three more on the next page as well. This is the importance of these rules, is to determine at what stage does the buyer take over the responsibility, because until then, the seller is responsible. Now, I was looking through Wikipedia, and as I say, I'll give you the reference at the end of the lecture. And it strikes me that they have a rather nice table, a rather handy table. And if you can remember it, if it comes easily to your mind, then you should find it's a very sensible and relatively straightforward way of learning this. And what we need is 7 columns. And again, there's no need for you to write this out. How many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No need for you to write it out, because you can copy it, you can download it, print it off Wikipedia. So I'll just illustrate how this works. We need 7 columns. We also need 7 rows. So that's 1, as well as the top row. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 1 at the bottom here, 7. And what we're going to do is we're going to identify whose responsibility it is at the different stages, depending upon the wording of the contract, depending on the Incoterm which is used in the contract. Let's just think about the actual stages of a sale, an international sale being made. I'm going to have to turn my screen sideways just momentarily so I can write sideways on, if you like. In this first one, where's that gone? In this first one, we have export clearance, and carriage to export port. And then next we have carriage to the import port. I'll read these through again so that if you do want to copy it yourself, then at least you don't have to struggle reading my writing. So I will read them through. Just let me get these 7 headings across the top. 6 headings. Carriage to the import port. Insurance. And then unloading at the import port. You have to view the word port casually, because port suggests that it's a seaside port, but it's not necessarily a seaside. This is any mode of transport, whether or not sea travel is involved. So unloading at the import port. Then we've got carriage to the destination place, which is where you want me to actually deliver these goods to. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then finally import duties and taxes. Import duties and taxes. So those are various costs and stages involved within the international sale and trade of goods. And then the expressions that we need to consider. The first one is X works, XW. X works, Latin, ancient Latin, meaning from or out of. So X works is when the goods are leaving my premises, my manufacturing plant. Then we've got FCA. I think what I'll do, no, there's no need. I was going to say I'll write these down on the screen, but there's no need because you've got them in the notes anyway. So FCA is free carrier, named place. Then we get to CPT, and that says carriage paid to. Remember in the notes, CPT and CIP are switched round. This is a more sensible, more logical sequence. And next time I update the notes, I will change that sequence. So CPT, carriage paid to. Now we've got CIP, which is carriage and insurance paid to. Carriage and insurance paid to. Then we have DAT, delivered at terminal. DAP, delivered at place. And DDP, delivered duty paid. Now these are the various stages and the various Incoterms which can and do apply. And we can look at them as follows. When the goods are sold ex works, the seller has no responsibility. Until they leave the sellers, the manufacturing plant, until they go out of that doorway, then obviously the seller's responsible. But once they leave those works, that's it. So from that moment on, if the contract is ex works, then the buyer is responsible. The buyer is going to be responsible for the safety and value and security of those goods. It's the buyer's responsibility. So if it's the buyer's responsibility for export clearance and for carriage to the export port, if it's the buyer's responsibility as the goods leave ex works, then it must be the buyer's responsibility right the way through. Because if you're responsible the moment it leaves the seller's premises, then you're responsible until it reaches your premises. FCA, free carrier, named place. The seller is saying, I will be responsible until I've given those goods over to a carrier. So I will sort out the export clearance. I will sort out the carriage to the export port. So the seller will be responsible for sorting out these formalities, export clearance and carriage to the export port. But from that moment on, the buyer takes responsibility. And if the buyer is responsible for carriage to the import port, whether it's by sea or otherwise, any mode of transport, then the buyer takes responsibility from that moment on. Carriage paid to. Well, again, the seller is saying, listen, I will pay the carriage. I will pay, and not only that, I will clear it for export, and I will pay the carriage to the export port. And I will pay the carriage to the import port. So the seller remains responsible all the way until it reaches the port, or presumably the point of entry into the buyer's country. So carriage to the import port. But I'm not going to pay the insurance. That's your job. And if you're going to pay the insurance from this point on, then the buyer is responsible from this point on. Carriage insurance paid. Carriage and insurance paid. The seller says, yes, I will pay that. I'll pay the insurance as well, but I'm not doing any more. No, that's up to you. The buyer will pay the rest. The buyer will pay the unloading at the import port. The buyer will pay the carriage to the destination place. The buyer will pay delivered duty paid, pay the import duties and the taxes and the levies. That's the buyer. Delivered at terminal, the seller Yeah, takes all these responsibilities to insurance and unloading at the import port. That's the terminal. And the seller says, I will pay all these costs up until the moment those goods have been unloaded. But once they've been unloaded, that's you. You have to pay them from now on. You take them from that import port, you put them on the carrier's vehicle, and you pay the costs of transport. And the duties, the import duties, that's the buyer's responsibility. Delivered at place, one step further. Not only will I deliver them to the import port, but I will actually put them on and pay for the carrier to deliver them to your place, delivered at place. So the seller says, I will pay these, I will pay all of these, but you pay the import duties. I'm not paying those. And delivered duty paid, well, what do you think? Can you see a pattern emerging here? Delivered duty paid, the seller takes responsibility right the way through, even the import duties. But of course, the seller will charge the buyer. The price will be reflective of the fact that the seller is taking on all of these. That's it for any mode of transport. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop this. I did say that I would give you the internet reference, the link, for this table so you can copy it out yourselves or print it off from the internet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop at this stage because am I going to, how much more have I got to do on this? No, let's do it. I was going to say, well, we'll stop at this stage and do a new short lecture, but I don't know how long I've been going. I'm trying to keep it down to manageable lengths. But if I stop talking or stop whittering on now, then we can do the next bit, which is carriage by sea, where sea transport is involved. And so what we have is another little table. There. I'll use this as a blank page. And again, I'll give you the reference at the end of this lecture. So we need, just this time, we need 4 lines, because there are 4 rules. 1, 2, 3, 4 rules. And we need 5 columns, one for the title, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and again, I'm going to have to turn the screen sideways. I'll swing it around a bit so that I can see where it is I'm writing. What's that doing there? That needs to come out. Okay. Export clearance. Export clearance and carriage to unloading at export port. So it comes out of my works. I'll sort out the export clearance. I'll put the goods in the hands of TNT or recognised or unrecognised carrier. And my carrier will take these goods to the port of export. And I will accept, as a seller, I will accept that responsibility. The next one is loading onto the ship. There used to be rules about as the goods are swinging by the crane and swinging around and they're going over the ship's rail and then they swing back again over the quayside and then the crane hauls her brakes and the goods come crashing down and break. Had the goods crossed the ship's rail when the hawser broke, or were they still over the quayside? If they land on the ship's rail and break, and some go into the water and some go onto the ship, that nonsense has gone. That has now gone. So swinging over the ship's side is no longer an issue. So we have loading onto the ship, carriage to the import port. Is the third category. And then finally we've got insurance. Now these 4 do fit in to the previous 7, any mode of transport. They do fit in terms of If it's any mode of transport, but it also involves sea, these can slot in. And they slot in, well, you should see them, you'll see it anyway on the Wikipedia. So we have here, first of all, free alongside ship, alongside the ship. That's on the quay side, on the side of the area of the harbour, the area of the port where goods are delivered to, and then a stevedore will use his crane and he'll pick these goods up and he'll move. So free alongside ship stops then. And then once they get on board, that's the next point where we have to stop. So free alongside ship, then we have free on board, then we have CFR, cost and freight, and then we have CIF, cost, insurance and freight. And what we're looking at here is to see whereabouts our buyer's responsibilities start and therefore where the seller's responsibilities finish. Free alongside ship, export clearance and carriage to the port, that's the seller. He's accepting that responsibility. I'll sort out the export clearance, I'll put the goods with the carrier, and he will deliver them until they are alongside the ship, and that's when my responsibility stops. And that's where your responsibility starts as the buyer. Free on board, this is this thing about the stevedore and the swinging, going backwards and forwards over the ship's rail. No. Once they're on board, that's the next stopping point. Until they're on board, the seller's still responsible. So they're responsible there, and they're responsible until the goods are actually loaded onto the ship. Once they're on the ship, the buyer takes responsibility. Cost and freight. Cost and freight is everything except the insurance. So all the carriage to the import port, the paying of the freightage to the shipping company, but not the insurance, just the paying of the freightage to the shipping company. The seller says, I'll pay these, but once they're at the import port, then you're the guy, you take over responsibility after that moment in time. And then finally, insurance. Costs, insurance and freight. I'll pay the freight, I'll pay the insurance, I'll pay the costs of carriage, I'll pay the lot. Seller. So seller pays all those costs, and he invoices the buyer and says, and it's also cost me carriage to the export port, storage at the export port, loading charges from the port onto the ship. I've had to pay the ship owner to carry the goods from my port to your port. I've had to pay for them to be unloaded. I've had to pay for them to be loaded onto another carrier, who's then going to deliver them. So I've got to pay for that delivery costs. I've got to pay them. And all the time I'm paying the insurance. So it's not going to cost you just $50,000 to buy these goods. It's going to cost you for all those other costs as well. But if I'd not paid them and recharged, you would have had to pay them anyway. So it's not as though it's loading onto the cost of the goods. It just streamlines the process of international trade and eliminates, to a great extent, international trade disputes. Now, I keep promising you this website address. If you put in https://en. Wikipedia.org / wiki / Incoterms, then you should find it all there. And that's it for chapter 3.